In 1992, a construction crew widening a freeway south of San Diego cut into the earth and struck something they were never supposed to find. Buried bones, cracked in a way that looked deliberate. When scientists finally dated them, the number that came back was so old, so far outside anything textbooks allowed, that most of the archaeological world simply refused to accept it. That number was 130,000 years. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans was simple and almost universally accepted. People crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, carrying a distinctive stone spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico. They were called the Clovis people, and for decades, suggesting anyone had arrived earlier was treated, in the words of one archaeologist, as roughly as credible as claiming you'd just seen Elvis walk out of a Burger King. Then a freeway excavation in San Diego cracked that certainty open. And once that crack appeared, researchers started looking differently at a handful of other sites that had been quietly dismissed and ignored for decades, each one asking the same unsettling question: what if the timeline everyone agreed on was simply wrong? Let's start with the freeway itself, because the discovery there set the tone for everything that followed. In November 1992, paleontologist Richard Cerutti was monitoring construction as California expanded State Route 54 in San Diego County, watching for fossils the way state law requires, whenever heavy equipment might disturb the ground. The machinery exposed a scatter of broken bone, and over the following 5 months, a team led by paleontologist Thomas Demarais carefully excavated the remains of a single American mastodon, a heavy-limbed relative of the modern elephant. What made this bone bed unusual wasn't just its age, it was the pattern of damage. The mastodon's limb bones had been shattered while still fresh, with spiral fractures consistent with a heavy object striking living bone rather than bones broken through ordinary decay or erosion. 2 massive femur balls lay side by side, one face up and one face down, and scattered through the surrounding sediment were 5 large stones that didn't belong there naturally, showing wear and impact marks consistent with use as hammers and anvils. When researchers tested the bones using uranium-thorium dating, a technique that measures the steady decay of specific elements rather than relying on carbon, which degrades too quickly to be useful at this age, the result wasn't 13,000 years. It was roughly 130,000 years, more than 100,000 years before the Clovis people, and tens of thousands of years before modern Homo sapiens is even believed to have left Africa. In their 2017 paper published in the journal Nature, the research team was careful not to claim these were modern humans. They couldn't. Instead, they proposed the site had been created by some unidentified earlier species of Homo, a cousin in the human family tree nobody had previously placed anywhere near North America at that time. The scientific response was immediate and sharp. Critics pointed to an uncomfortable possibility. The site had been discovered by heavy construction equipment tearing through the ground, and that same machinery might have cracked the bones and driven the stones into the sediment entirely by accident. Others argued the fracture patterns could be produced by entirely natural forces, other animals scavenging the carcass, or simply the slow, crushing weight of sediment accumulating over 130,000 years. Demarais never claimed to have every answer, and openly acknowledged that a single site couldn't rewrite an entire paradigm on its own. But the door had been opened, and once it was, researchers started re-examining other sites that had been sitting, dismissed, for decades. Roughly 3,000 miles north, in Canada's Yukon Territory, sit the Bluefish Caves, 3 modest limestone hollows overlooking the Bluefish River in a region called Beringia, the ancient land bridge that connected Asia to the Americas during the last ice age, when lower sea levels exposed a vast, cold, grassy corridor between the 2 continents. Between 1977 and 1987, archaeologist Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated these caves and found what he believed were cut marks on animal bones, evidence of human butchery dating back as far as 30,000 years. In the Clovis first era of the 1980s, that claim was treated as absurd, and Cinq-Mars spent decades watching his work dismissed, growing convinced the scientific establishment had never seriously examined his evidence at all. Long after most people had stopped paying attention, French archaeologist Lauriane Bourgeon returned to the same stored collection of bones with modern tools and modern eyes. Examining more than 30,000 bone fragments, she found, on the jawbone of an ancient horse, a series of clean, parallel cuts positioned exactly where a stone blade would slice to remove the animal's tongue, not the ragged marks of a predator's teeth or the scrape of a trampling hoof. When these bones were radiocarbon dated at a laboratory in Oxford, the 2017 results confirmed humans had been butchering horses in these caves as far back as 24,000 years ago, making Bluefish Caves the oldest confirmed archaeological site in North America at the time, and quietly vindicating a researcher who had been mocked for most of his career, though he died in 2021, still waiting for full acceptance. The finding also fit neatly with a broader theory called the Beringian Standstill, which proposes that a small founding population became isolated on this land bridge for thousands of years, walled off by glaciers to the south, before finally moving into the continent once the climate warmed enough to open a path. High in the mountains of northern Zacatecas, Mexico, sits Chiquihuit Cave, nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. Archaeologist Cyprian Ardelin spent years excavating there, eventually recovering nearly 2,000 pieces of broken limestone his team identified as deliberately shaped tools, flakes, blades, and cores, buried in layers dating back 31,000 to 33,000 years, with clearest evidence of occupation clustering around 26,500 years ago. Published in Nature in 2020, the claim faced immediate serious pushback, because the cave contained no human bones and no confirmed hearths, only the stones themselves. A team led by Jim Chatters and Ben Potter argued the objects were likely geofacts, stones naturally fractured by rockfall and sliding debris that simply happened to resemble deliberate tools, a phenomenon well documented in similar cave environments. Ardelin defended his findings directly, personally analyzing the strongest specimens for signs of intentional shaping, and the dispute remains genuinely unresolved. Along the Savannah River in South Carolina sits Topper, a quarry site where archaeologist Albert Goodyear, after establishing a solid, respected Clovis-era presence there through the 1990s, made the unusual decision in 1998 to dig below the layer most archaeologists treated as the floor of American human history. He found tools dating to roughly 16,000 years, and then, in 2004, pushed even deeper, recovering chipped stone alongside carbonized plant material that returned radiocarbon dates of roughly 50,000 years. At the outer edge of what radiocarbon dating can reliably measure at all, critics questioned whether the dark stain was even a human fire rather than a natural wildfire, and noted that tools from such a vast span of time looked nearly identical, which isn't how genuine human tool-making traditions typically evolve. Goodyear held his position for the rest of his career, and Topper remains, to this day, a genuine unresolved question mark rather than a settled claim in either direction. Two of the most extreme claims come from figures whose reputations were shaped enormously by how they responded to controversy. No human remains were ever found there, and geologist Vance Haynes concluded the stones were geofacts, shaped by an ancient river and debris flow rather than human hands. Leakey's own wife, Mary, a distinguished scientist in her own right, wrote that his involvement in Calico had cost him real professional respect, calling the excavation catastrophic to his reputation. He defended the site until his death in 1972. And in the Valsequillo Basin near Puebla, Mexico, sits Hueyatlaco, arguably the single most contested site on this entire list. Excavated beginning in the early 1960s, the site contained genuinely sophisticated stone tools, finely flaked blades, and projectile points found alongside the bones of Ice Age megafauna. Geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre applied multiple independent dating methods to the volcanic ash and sediment surrounding the tools, and the results centered around 260,000 years, with one method suggesting as much as 370,000 years. Lead archaeologist Cynthia Irwin-Williams called the dates irresponsible and refused to accept them. Steen McIntyre maintained the results were solid and has said publicly that defending them cost her career. Skeptics argue that reworked volcanic sediment, older material mixed with younger layers through natural processes, can produce dramatically inflated ages, and no comparably ancient site has ever been confirmed anywhere else in the Americas. The dispute has never been resolved in either direction. So here's where the honest picture of this entire decades-long controversy actually lands. 6 separate sites, a San Diego freeway, a frozen Yukon cave, a mountaintop in Mexico, a river quarry in South Carolina, a California desert, and a highland basin each produced broken stone in ancient earth. And each time, the same specific, unresolved question emerged. Did a human genuinely shape this object, or did natural geological forces simply make it look that way? Some of these claims are probably wrong. The geofact problem is real, and skepticism toward extraordinary dates built on ambiguous stone evidence is a reasonable, scientifically sound instinct, not obstruction for its own sake. But while archaeologists argued over broken rocks, a separate site in White Sands, New Mexico, eventually produced something that couldn't be explained away by natural fracturing at all. Actual human footprints, preserved in ancient lakebed mud, including tracks of adults and children, one set apparently following a giant ground sloth across the flats. A footprint isn't a geofact. It's a direct, unambiguous record of a person's presence, a specific individual on a specific day, walking across specific ground. The dating process behind this discovery was deliberately, exhaustively thorough, precisely because researchers understood how much skepticism any claim in this territory would face after decades of disputed sites. Rather than relying on a single method, the team dated the footprints using multiple independent techniques: radiocarbon dating of seed layers embedded directly above and below the footprint horizon, separate analysis of ancient pollen grains, and optically stimulated luminescence testing on quartz grains within the mud itself, a method that measures when sediment was last exposed to sunlight. Testing was conducted at 2 separate laboratories, and every method converged on the same range, between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, thousands of years before Clovis, during the coldest peak of the last ice age, exactly when the traditional model insisted the Americas were still empty of people. That level of independent, cross-validated agreement is precisely what had been missing from every one of the 6 disputed sites that came before it. And it's exactly why White Sands succeeded where Calico, Hueyatlaco, and Topper had each stalled in permanent unresolved controversy. That's the quiet resolution hiding inside decades of bitter, unresolved dispute. But together, they forced the door open wide enough that when genuinely undeniable evidence finally arrived at White Sands, the field was no longer positioned to dismiss it outright the way it once dismissed everything that came before it. So we want to ask you directly of these 6 disputed sites, which one do you think is most likely to eventually be vindicated the way White Sands already has been? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the kind where the real discovery is watching an entire field slowly, reluctantly admit it might have been wrong, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're heading somewhere just as remarkable. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the version of history you were handed